Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 159, The Rise to Imperial Power, Charles IV, Journey to Rome, which is also episode 22 of season 8, From the Interregnum to the Golden Bull. This season has now gone on for 22 episodes. We started with the interregnum of largely absent rulers, and after a brief renaissance under Rudolf von Habsburg, the empire became a sort of oligarchy, where three families, the Luxemburgs, the Wittelsbachs and the Habsburgs, took turns on the throne. Succession usually involved some form of armed conflict between the contenders and a struggle with the Pope over who had precedence. And then whoever emerged victorious used the ever-dwindling imperial powers to enrich his family at the expense of the others. So when in 1349 Karel, Charles IV emerged triumphant from the latest of these conflicts, chances were that the same game would start anew. Civil war between the three families, excommunication and murder. But it did not. And why it did not is what we're going to talk about in this episode. But before we can all breathe a great sigh of relief, the gods have made it so, then I have to hold the beggar's bowl up to you again, my graceful listeners. The show is, as you know, free of advertising, apart from this, my grovelling. And if you want to keep yourself safe from me droning on about my varied mental health issues, holiday rental preferences or sleeping problems, there is only one thing to do. Go to historyofthegermans.com/support and give generously. And thanks so much to Michael W., Admiral Geekington, Timo B., and another Admiral, this time an Admiral von Schneider, Barry M., and Greg B., who've already signed up. Now, next thing, I have to admit to an error, or more precisely, to a serious lack of knowledge. I did say last week that the Cathedral of St. Vitus in Prague was unique, inasmuch that it sat on the top of a hill, half an hour's walk from the center of the city, and within the precincts of the royal castle. Now, all that is correct, apart from the bit about it being unique. As some of you pointed out, the cathedrals of Meissen and Krakow are similarly inside the compound of the territorial ruler, away from the city center. I then looked at the locations of several other cathedrals founded east of the Elbe River, and it becomes clear that the concept of the cathedral inside the royal or ducal compound is the norm rather than the exception. Esztergom, Naumburg, Brunn, to name just a few, have a similar setup. However, west of the Elbe, in particular in the lands that had once been part of the Roman Empire, cathedral churches tended to be in the center of town. And that makes sort of sense. Because the citizens of the Roman Empire had largely converted to Christianity by the 4th or 5th century, and hence when the bishops built their cathedrals and palaces, they did so amongst the faithful, largely independent from the secular ruler. Meanwhile, the pagan Slavs who lived east of the Elbe had been converted by fire and sword in the 10th, 11th and 12th century, which meant the bishops' churches had to be located within the castles of the rulers for protection against a hostile population. And that is where they remained, often to this day. The fact that I could not remember a place where a cathedral was located in the royal castle reveals the experience of someone who had grown up in West Germany and has not travelled anywhere as extensively in Central Europe as I should have. And I have been reading books by predominantly West German authors who also seem to suffer from the same bias. That is history for you, so often as much about the author than it is about the subject. So I will try to do better next time, and please keep these corrections coming. And with that, back to the show. Last week, we discussed Karl IV's political and architectural projects in Bohemia. But this was, however, only one of the crowns he had now acquired. As we discussed as long as 3 episodes ago, Karl had managed also to overcome the opposition and had been unanimously elected by all 7 electors and then crowned King of the Romans in Aachen in 1349. In 1350, he had reconciled with his last remaining serious adversary, Ludwig the Elder, the son of the Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian and Markgraf of Brandenburg. This reconciliation involved, on the one hand, that Ludwig would be returned to his margraviate and that the current usurper, now dubbed a false Valdemar, would be dropped. and in return, Ludwig handed over the imperial regalia, including the Holy Lance, the Purse of Saint Stephen, various coats and socks, and the imperial crown. All things Charles IV, as we know, really cherishes. Now, beyond this exchange, Karl also promised to use his influence at the papal court in Avignon to finally lift the excommunication Pope John XXII had put on Ludwig's father, and then ultimately over the whole Wittelsbach family 30 years earlier. But shortly after that, all political activity at the royal court ceased. That was in part down to the plague, which had by now reached Bohemia. But there was also a mysterious illness. For about a year, the king of the Romans was afflicted by some sort of paralysis none of his doctors could identify. It wasn't the plague, otherwise he would have either died or recovered much more quickly. Nor was it the gout he would suffer from for the rest of his life. This sudden loss of ability to act, move, and even speak remains a mystery, not least because none of the sources from the court mention it at all. We only know of it through the sources from the empire who noticed the absence of their ruler. Karl finally rose from his sickbed in 1352, but he never fully recovered. His spine remained impaired, giving him a somewhat hunched appearance. His days as a shiny knight at tournaments were now comprehensively over. Well, he had never enjoyed them very much and only taken part when it had been absolutely unavoidable. He was in that, as in so many other things, not his father's son. Another way in which he differed from the knightly blind king was in his preference for diplomacy over war. War was expensive and unpredictable, whilst playing the different sides against each other was cheap, intellectually thrilling, and something he was just very, very good at. Having made peace with the Wittelsbachs, one of the great imperial families of the 14th century, he now needed to settle things with the other one, the House of Habsburg. Now, the Habsburgs had done all right under the Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian. They had gained the Duchy of Carinthia and the County of Tyrol, and the latter turned out to be a genuine lottery win, as silver mining in the region was gaining pace. Over the next 300 years, more and more mines opened in Tyrol, the largest in a place called Schwaz, which would at some point employ 10,000 miners who dug up 85% of all silver found in Europe. Now, whilst this is all good news for the Dukes of Austria, not everything was going according to plan. For one, the usually so fertile family had experienced one of its occasional bouts of reproductive decline and was reduced to just Albrecht II, the lame, and his son Rudolf IV, the founder. But the biggest issue were some renegade peasants in their original homeland. The three cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Nidwalden, that had defeated Duke Leopold at Morgarten in 1315, have continued to undermine Habsburg control of the Aargau and then also of all the roads leading to the Gotthard Pass. In 1332, the city of Lucerne, until then part of the Habsburg zone of influence, had joined the three Waldstätten and had formed the Eternal Swiss Confederation. In 1351, Zurich, then and now the largest city in Switzerland, joined the Confederation. In 1353, Bern, Zug, and Glarus came in as well. This had now become more than an irritation for the Habsburgs, and Karl was happy to exploit the situation. He offered the Habsburgs to rein in on these obstinate commoners, if Albrecht and Rudolf kept the peace and let him pass down to Italy should he ever want to go to Rome. And to further firm up the alliance, Rudolf became engaged and then later married Catherine, the daughter of Karl and, in the absence of a son, his heiress. Now Karl never really made good on his promise to go after the Swiss. He joined the Habsburgs and their army attacking Zurich, but after a few skirmishes forced the parties onto the negotiation table. The subsequent peace included the recognition of the Swiss Confederation, very much to the chagrin of the Habsburgs. But by then it was too late, and there was very little they could do about it. It is with these kinds of promises of help that rarely materialized in actual military support and the generous handing out of titles and imperial vicariates that Karl solidified his reign in the empire. Having dealt with Wittelsbachs and Habsburg in 1354, he moved his focus to the western side of the empire. One reason was that his great-uncle, the legendary Archbishop of Trier, Balduin, had finally passed away at the grand old age of 69. Having become Archbishop aged 22, he had lifted two members of his family onto the imperial throne, his brother Henry VII and now Karl. In the meantime, he had fostered the power of the electors at the Kurverein zu Reims, and at the same time had strengthened the territorial power of his archbishopric. Karl may have never liked him, and vice versa, but they had supported each other in the interest of the dynasty. So, when Karl rushed to Trier as soon as news had reached him of his relative's demise, he wasn't there to mourn his long-lost mentor. No, what he was after was a legendary hoard of gold and silver everyone believed the wily bishop had gathered during his 47 years on the episcopal throne. But when Karl arrived, the treasure, if it had ever existed, was gone. Still, he coerced the new archbishop to hand back the lands his great-uncle had forced him to hand over as an electoral bribe in 1344, and in the absence of precious metal, he raided the spiritual wealth of this, the oldest cathedral in the German lands, the staff of St. Peter, a third of the veil of the Virgin Mary, a piece of the finger of St. Matthew, and then the obligatory piece of the Holy Cross were all packed up and sent to Prague. Then he went to Luxemburg, where his half-brother Wenceslas had now turned 18. Wenceslas was supposed to inherit Luxemburg, but Karl had seized it upon their father's death. But now it was time to honor the blind King John's wishes, and Wenceslas received Luxemburg, which Karl also elevated to a duchy and imperial principality at the same time. Young Wenceslas then married Joanna, the eldest daughter and heiress of the duchies of Brabant and Limburg, which was followed by the happy event of Duke John of Brabant dying in 1356. Wenceslas and his wife gained control of this exceedingly wealthy part of the world after granting the citizens of Brabant a large number of rights in a document called the Joyeuse Entrée, which we will look at next week. For the moment, the important point is that the Luxemburgs got hold of Brabant, at least tripling their position in the west, and all that against opposition from the Count of Flanders, and then behind him, the King of France. The empire was on the up. And to make it absolutely clear that there was a new broom in the house, willing to protect the western border of the empire against constant French incursions, Karl held an imperial diet in the city of Metz, right on the border to France. No emperor had been to Metz since the days of the Hohenstaufen. And this event in March 1354 was meant to rebuild the sense of belonging to the empire that had been waning in the region. Ever more often had the local powers taken their disputes to the courts and parliaments of France, believing that there was no justice to be obtained from the weak imperial power. Karl imposed an imperial peace on Lotharingia, whereby they would resolve their conflicts peaceably in courts of their own peers, rather than having them adjudicated by the French. Such local peace agreements called Landfrieden had been a tool of imperial policy for a long time, but the last decades had seen them running out and or being ignored. Karl used them extensively in all the areas he travelled through, and he could back them up with the sheer strength of his personal wealth and prestige. In the east, the House of Luxemburg controlled Bohemia, which had almost doubled in size since the days of Ottokar II, and in the west they ruled the combined duchies of Luxembourg and Brabant. And Karl could rely on the support of great imperial cities, in particular the richest and most powerful of them, Nuremberg. So many citizens of the empire experienced imperial administration for the very first time. Within just 6 years, by 1355, Karl had become the most effective guardian of the empire in generations. With the German lands under his control, we move on to, yes, I can hear you groan, the inevitable journey to Rome. Should that not be over by now? Didn't the electors declare that the elected king was automatically the ruler of the entire empire, even without coronation or approbation by the Pope? Did Karl not remember the catastrophic outcome of his grandfather's attempt to pacify Italy, let alone his own experience as a young man trying to chart a path through the endless squabbles between various communes, republics, and autocracies? Sure, he did. But even though an imperial Romzug was no longer an absolute must, it still added to the cachet of an emperor, in particular an emperor like Karl, who derived more of his power from symbols and the letter of the law than from yielding of swords. So, a trip to Rome was on the agenda, but such a trip was not as urgent as it had been for his grandfather or for Ludwig the Bavarian. Karl had time to plan how he could thread his course through the convoluted Italian and papal politics. Papal politics should have been easy. As we have discussed before, Karl owed the beginnings of his career to his mentor, the Pope Clement VI, but by the 1350s, that relationship had soured. When Karl reconciled with the excommunicated Wittelsbachs, first by marrying the daughter of the Count Palatinate on the Rhine, and then by making these deals with the sons of Ludwig the Bavarian, the Pope was incensed. The whole point of supporting Karl as the new king of the Romans had been to squash the Wittelsbachs and their nest of heretics that was Munich. And once the excommunicated usurpers were gone, the popes would then regain control of the imperial church. Well, none of that happened. Karl had no intention of becoming a papal lapdog. Instead of taking orders from Avignon, he strengthened the imperial oversight of the church to the point that he invested more bishops during his reign than any emperor had done since Barbarossa. What also did not help was that Karl let slip that he found Clement VI's propensity for bling and hard partying unsuitable for his office, comments that made their way back to Avignon. With Clement VI refusing to send cardinals to crown him, Karl had two options. One was to boost his diplomatic efforts in Avignon in the hope of changing Clement's mind. The other was to do as his predecessor had done and go to Rome to accept the crown from the Senate and people of Rome, as the ancient Roman emperors from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus have done. This latter option materialized in 1350, in the form of a visit to Prague by Cola di Rienzi, the tribune of the people of Rome. Cola di Rienzi is one of those characters that warrant a whole podcast by themselves, and I may produce one for the Patreon feed at some point. But since he's very much a figure of Italian history rather than German history, here are just the bare bones of the story. Cola di Rienzi, actual name Nicola Gabrini, was the son of a wine merchant. Being clever and talented, he received a thorough education and rose to become a notary and diplomat for the city of Rome. In 1347, he led a public revolt that catapulted him to the leadership of the city, where he promised to resurrect the ancient Roman Republic with him as the tribune of the people. How come a wine merchant's son can rise to be the ruler of the eternal city? The answer lies in the truly dissolute state of Rome and the Papal States in the middle of the 14th century. It is now almost 2 generations since the popes had left Rome to settle in Avignon. Without the papal court, the income streams that had sustained the city had dried up. Not just the lavish expenditure of the popes and cardinals, but also the bribes paid for ecclesiastical judgments, the approval of episcopal appointments, the income from absolutions, etc., etc., all that was now sent to Provence. Rome, unlike the other great Italian cities, did not have much commercial or industrial activity. Barely 20,000 souls lived in a city once built for millions. To generate some cash, the popes had declared holy years in 1300 and in 1350 that brought in thousands of pilgrims. This tradition of the Holy Year exists to this day, and by the way, the next one is in 2025. But these jubilees took place only every 50 years at the time. In the intervening years, the impoverished Romans had fallen into the hands of warring aristocratic factions, the Colonna and the Orsini. most Romans huddled within the bend of the Tiber, marked by the triangle of the Mausoleum of Augustus at the north, Castel Sant'Angelo to the west, and the Tiber Island to the south, the area called the Abitato. The Vatican Borgo, stretching from St. Peter's to the river, retained its boundaries set by the walls of Leo IV. The remaining 215 hectares, almost 4.7 square miles within the ancient Aurelian Wall, lay nearly empty. This disabitato remained a dangerous waste of forest, vineyard and garden, interrupted only by the irregular masses of Rome's fortified monasteries and the fortress towers of its barons, by hamlets scattered around the major churches, and the militarized hulks of Rome's vast ruins. Meanwhile, in Florence, Siena, Milan and Venice, churches and palaces rose up that could rival the splendor that had once been Rome's. Cola di Rienzi tapped into the discontent of the Roman masses, promising them an end to the current mismanagement and a return to the glory of ancient Rome. By all accounts, he was an engaging orator who could whip up the crowds. He was also a populist and fantasist who promised the world but was unable to maintain a functioning administration, let alone deliver on any of these pledges. His first run as tribune of the Roman people lasted a mere 7 months, at the end of which he slunk out of town in the middle of the night. From 1347 onwards, he hid for 2 years in a community of Franciscans who adhered to the rule of strict poverty, promoted by Michael of Cesena and William of Ockham. In 1349, he embarked on a journey across the plague-ridden Europe in search for allies who could help him restore the glory of Rome. That is why he showed up at the court of Karl IV in Prague in 1350. And the emperor was listening. After all, Cola di Rienzi still had supporters in Rome and actually all across Italy, including the celebrated poet Petrarch. Though Karl may have been tempted by Cola's proposal to get his coronation swiftly and with the support of the Roman populace, but there were a number of issues with that though. One was that his predecessor, who had accepted the crown from the people and not from the Pope, had always faced issues of legitimacy. Karl himself had never recognized Ludwig's imperial title. Moreover, it would have been a truly unforgivable affront to the Pope that would turn the simmering disappointment into an open conflict. A conflict that, judging by the example of Ludwig, could go on for decades and hamper his efforts to stabilize the empire under his reign. So, Karl had Cola di Rienzi arrested and sent over to Avignon. By all accounts, that should have been a death sentence for the poor Cola. But by the time he had arrived, Pope Clement VI had died, and his successor, Innocent VI, saw an opportunity in that plebeian rebel-rouser. In 1354, he sent Cola di Rienzi together with a cardinal to Rome to oust the regime of the aristocrats and bring order to the place, make it ready for a return of the Pope. Cola's second attempt to restore ancient Rome lasted even shorter than the first. Rienzi made some stirring speeches and put the Colonna and Orsini on trial. He managed to have a few of them beheaded before the two arch-enemies joined hands, and also the cardinal realized that Rienzi may not be entirely on board with the idea of the return of the Holy Father. A crowd gathered outside the Palazzo Senatorio on the Capitoline Hill, demanding Cola's head. He tried to make one last speech to defend himself and his track record, but he could not get heard. The mob set the palace alight. Cola di Rienzi fled the building in disguise, but he was recognized and then horrifically maimed and killed just where his statue now stands at the bottom of the Capitoline Hill. As I said, a fascinating and dramatic story that Richard Wagner made into his first and worst opera, and that allegedly inspired Adolf Hitler. As I said, well worth a whole podcast. But why does this story matter beyond the fact that Karl had rejected the offer to be crowned by the people of Rome? What it illustrates is how far the power of the Avignon Church had declined. If a pope has to resort to a populist firebrand in his attempt to exert control over his capital, the situation must be quite dire. And it was. These 40 years in Avignon had had a devastating effect on the standing of the Church. We have not gone quite all the way back to the days of the pornocracy in the 9th and 10th century, but a lot of the political capital the reform popes since Leo X have patiently built into the imperial papacy has been washed away in an excess of corruption and ostentatious display of wealth. And then there was the political dependency on the French kings, who could force a pope to sanction the raid on the Templars. Few people in the cities and villages ever saw the extravagant luxury of the papal palace, but what they did see was what happened to the Franciscans and Dominicans. These mendicant orders enjoyed a lot of respect for their good works and adherence to the vows of poverty. And when John XXII forced them into accepting gifts and property, the brothers, and even more, the papacy, lost the moral high ground. And it was the moral high ground, not the soldiers, that papal power was based on. More and more voices criticized the Pope and demanded a change in his behavior and a return to Rome. One of them was the poet laureate Petrarch, and another was Saint Bridget of Sweden. She was a high aristocrat who had come to Rome during the Holy Year of 1350. Shocked by the state of the city, she threw herself into charitable works and, as things got traction, founded her own order of nuns. What made her famous across Europe were her religious visions. And in one of those visions, God told her to tell Pope Clement, quote, "It shall not be forgotten how greed and ambition flourished and increased in the church during your time, or that you could have reformed and set many things right, but that you, lover of the flesh, were unwilling. Get up, therefore, before your fast approaching final hour arrives, and extinguish the negligence of your past by being zealous in your nearly final hour." End quote. Well, Pope Clement's final hour arrived in 1352 as predicted, and the Church tried to improve. They replaced the worldly Pope Clement VI with Innocent VI, an altogether more sober head of the Church. But the Pope's room for maneuver was very limited. Reforming the Church back to a semblance of moral authority ran into the opposition of entrenched interests. His attempt to regain Rome through Cola di Rienzi had failed and left him marooned in Avignon under the watchful eye of the French. It was exactly this weakness of the Pope that Karl bet on. Innocent VI did not have many options to counterweigh French influence, and the Empire was one of them. Karl may have not lived up to papal expectations, but he was still a lot less overbearing than the King of France. And he had enormous prestige, and still some influence in Italy. And that is why Karl was confident that once he were to set off for Rome, the new Pope would fall into line and send him a cardinal for the coronation. And that is what he did. Karl set off for Italy in September 1355 with just 300 men. The reason he did not bring an army, as his grandfather had done, was simple. He had no interest in conquering Italy. All he wanted was to travel down to Rome, get crowned, and go home again. He had made that very explicit in a letter he had written to Petrarch. The great poet had begged him to bring peace to his war-ridden Italy, and to that Karl responded, quote, "The times have changed, my most venerated poet laureate. Freedom has been crushed. The bride of the empire, together with all the other Latins, have been wedded into servitude. Justice has become the whore of avarice. Peace has been driven out of the people's minds, and the virtues of man have vanished, so that the world is descending into the abyss." End quote. No, Karl had been to Italy before, and he got the t-shirt. No way was he going to take sides in this never-ending game of whack-a-mole. All he wanted was free passage. And to achieve that, he joined an alliance led by Venice against Milan. Now, once he had crossed the lands of his allies, he headed for Milan, signed a deal with the city's rulers, the Visconti, who handed him 150,000 gold florin and the Iron Crown of Lombardy. Next stop was Florence, where he promised the Florentines help against the Milanese in exchange for 100,000 florins and the recognition of imperial overlordship, which was the first time in centuries that the city on the Arno River had bent the knee. Next stop Siena, which makes Karl their podesta in exchange for protection against the Florentines, and so forth and so forth. I guess you get my drift. So somehow this had turned into a veritable walk in the park. And part of his success is clearly his diplomatic skill that allows him to double-cross all his interlocutors with impunity. But he's also genuinely popular. He's one of the very few emperors who speak Italian. Wherever he goes, he chats with the people, he gets down from his horse to shake hands. And they even forgive him his now obsessive raids on churches and monasteries for relics. And he remains calm in all circumstances, both when the citizens of Siena parade him through the city on their shoulders in triumph, as well as when a rebellion in Pisa puts him and his new third wife in mortal danger. On April 2nd does he arrive before Rome. And for the next 3 days he visits all the great basilicas and monasteries of the Eternal City, disguised as a pilgrim. Most probably many a saint was missing a few bones once that mysterious pilgrim had left. The coronation date, however, was set for the 5th of April. Which now leaves the question, is there a cardinal available to perform the ceremony? Oh, you bet. Though Karl had not even bothered to inform the Pope of his departure for Rome 7 months earlier, but as soon as he was underway, Innocent VI caved in. The Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, the number 2 in the papal hierarchy, was promptly dispatched to Rome to do the deed. The only condition was that Karl should not spend more than a day in the Eternal City. And so, for the first time in 150 years did Rome see a peaceful imperial coronation. Both St. Peter's and the Lateran opened their doors to the emperor, and he and his wife were crowned, following the ancient coronation ordo. No wading through blood, no arrows shot into the dining hall, just a really nice party. As promised, Karl IV left Rome at sundown and returned to his lands north of the Alps as the universally recognized Holy Roman Emperor. And he was truly universally recognized. The Pope accepted him, the Italian cities, as far as they ever would, recognized him as their king and emperor. The Wittelsbachs and the Habsburgs had made their peace with him. His family possessions, the much enlarged kingdom of Bohemia and the duchies of Luxemburg and Brabant, made him the by far richest and by far most powerful imperial prince. Not since the early days of Frederick Barbarossa had an emperor gained such a position of power. And it was this power he would now use to create what many called the Constitution of the Holy Roman Empire, the Golden Bull of 1356. And that is what we are going to look at next week. And I hope you will join us again. And if you felt swept away by all that goodwill and splendor in the history of the Germans, remember that the show is advertising free thanks to the generosity of our patrons, and you can become a patron too. All you have to do is go to historyofthegermans.com/support and sign up for the cost of a latte per month.